In a galaxy filled with danger, a human operative and an alien mechanic form an unexpected alliance to uncover the corruption of the ruthless Darkstar Syndicate. From high-stakes heists to daring escapes, this journey is packed with twists, high tension, and a powerful partnership that might change everything. Will they complete their mission, or will the Syndicate crush their hopes? Stay tuned as we plunge into this action-packed HFY story where trust, betrayal, and survival collide in the vastness of space. In the cold, endless void of space, where every heartbeat could be your last, Max Carter found himself caught in the crosshairs of fate. His mission, to retrieve the stolen data core from the most dangerous station in the sector, was supposed to be quick and straightforward. But as the blaring sirens echoed through the deserted halls, Max realized nothing was as simple as it seemed. The station had fallen into the hands of the ruthless Darkstar Syndicate, and now he was on their radar. With every passing second, the walls seemed to close in tighter, the flashing lights only adding to the chaos around him. His pulse thundered in his ears as laser fire tore past, barely missing him. "Atlas, come on!" Max hissed, sweat dripping down his face as he ducked behind a pillar, his blaster firing in return. But Atlas, his trusted droid, wasn't exactly helping. In fair Verona, where we lay our scene, Atlas's metallic voice boomed theatrically from his speakers, as if they were caught in a Shakespearean play rather than a pirate-infested nightmare. Max cursed under his breath. "Not now, Atlas! Focus!" A shot grazed his jacket, leaving a singed mark on the leather. His heart raced, but Max didn't have time to think, only to act. If he didn't get out of there now, he'd become space debris. He sprinted down the corridor, the sound of pirate footsteps closing in with every passing second. His only chance? A sealed airlock, though even that seemed too far away. "By the gods, this is not how I plan to die," Max muttered, firing at the pirates emerging from the shadows, their masks glinting under the emergency lights. There was no time to hesitate. He shot first, taking down one pirate, but two more quickly took his place, closing in on him. Just when it seemed like the pressure would break, the unexpected happened. A crackling sound filled the air, followed by complete darkness. The station's power failed, leaving only the distant hum of emergency lighting. Max didn't wait for the lights to return. He grabbed Atlas, now sputtering, "To thine own self be true," and sprinted toward the escape tunnel he knew was their only chance. He barely fit through the narrow maintenance corridor, the sound of the pirates' voices growing closer. But it wasn't escape waiting for him at the tunnel's end. It was something far more dangerous, something that would change everything Max thought he knew about the mission and about himself. Max's pulse was still racing as the Star Voyager docked with Centura Station, the only place he could find a semblance of safety, or at least a mechanic who could fix Atlas before he shut down completely. He leaned back in his seat, eyes scanning the blinking warning lights on his dashboard. The engine hummed a tired tune as it powered down, and for a brief moment, all he could hear was the faint buzz of his own thoughts. "Atlas, can you hear me?" Max asked, his voice sharp, breaking the silence in the cockpit. The droid's eyes flickered weakly, but its voice came through, unmistakably, even in its malfunctioning state. "Now is the winter of our discontent," Atlas replied, his voice distorted, as though caught between two realities. Max clenched his fists. "You are killing me, Atlas," Max muttered under his breath. "You couldn't have picked a worse time for your poetic nonsense, could you? Would you prefer I call you thou art a villain?" Atlas quipped, its usual dry humor coming through. Max's lips twitched, fighting back a smile. "You're lucky I'm not in the mood for Shakespeare. We've got enough trouble already." He glanced at the station ahead, an enormous structure floating against the backdrop of endless stars. The sleek, polished metal walls gleamed invitingly. But Max knew better. It was all a facade, masking the bureaucracy and red tape that made Centura Station infamous. The station's docking bay hissed open with a loud bang, and Max stepped out, dragging Atlas behind him on a hover dolly. The hallways inside were pristine, the cold metallic floors reflecting the bright overhead lights. A few travelers passed by, their faces indifferent to the man with the malfunctioning droid. Max gritted his teeth as the sound of his boots echoed through the sterile corridors. A voice crackled through his comm link as he entered the station's service area. Unidentified vessel, state your business, a bored voice demanded. This is Max Carter. I've got a droid in need of emergency repairs, he responded, his voice level, hiding the irritation bubbling just under the surface. Processing. Please submit Form X-115 for mechanical assistance. The voice gave a mechanical pause. Please be advised, non-standard requests require additional documentation. Max groaned, the frustration making his muscles tense. He barely had time to deal with these forms, let alone stand around waiting for approval. Right. Just point me to the nearest mechanic and I'll handle the rest. There was another long pause. Docking Bay 47C has been assigned. You may fill out the necessary paperwork upon arrival. Max slammed the comm link off, muttering to himself. Paperwork, of course. It's never simple. He wheeled Atlas into the next hallway, dodging the curious gazes of passersby. Most were busy with their own tasks, but a few lingered, eyeing the damaged droid. Max gave them a terse nod, silently wishing he could just get this over with. The sooner Atlas was fixed, the sooner he could get back to the real mission, the data core. After what felt like an eternity, he finally reached Bay 47C. The doors slide open, revealing a high-end repair shop with all manner of machines being carefully worked on by station technicians. A large sign read Voss Robotics and Repair in bold letters, flashing across multiple languages. Inside, the sound of whirring tools and clicking diagnostics filled the air. Max took a deep breath. This was it. He had no time to waste. The shop's doorbell jingled as Max stepped inside, pushing Atlas along. A technician looked up, wiping grease from his hands. "Can I help you?" "I need a mechanic," Max said curtly, scanning the room. His eyes landed on a woman working in the corner, surrounded by holographic tools and floating parts. Her sharp, focused eyes were fixed on the small device she was repairing, her movements quick and precise. The technician gave him a brief look. "Nina Voss is your best bet. She's in the back." Max didn't waste any time. He approached the woman without hesitation. "Nina Voss?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. The woman turned, her striking features illuminated by the flickering diagnostic screens. Her skin shimmered like a deep azure under the fluorescent lights, and her hair was tied back in a practical braid. Her eyes, a shade of green that reminded him of the far-off jungles he once flew over, held a glint of intelligence and curiosity. She sized him up before speaking. "I'm Nina," she said, her voice calm but with an edge that hinted at experience. "What brings you to my humble repair shop?" Max cleared his throat. "I need my droid fixed. He's malfunctioning." He gestured toward Atlas, who, despite being powered down, still muttered Shakespearean quotes under his breath. Nina's eyes narrowed slightly as she examined Atlas. "Mark 7 model," she muttered to herself. "A rare one." She stepped closer, her fingers tracing the droid's exterior, scanning the damage with practiced ease. "What did he do to deserve this kind of malfunction?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Max hesitated for a moment before answering. He decided to start quoting plays instead of following orders. "I had to shut him down with an EMP." Nina let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Well, that's one way to deal with it." She studied the droid's insides, her expression shifting from intrigue to surprise. "You've done some heavy modifications on him. This isn't just a standard Mark 7. Who did this?" Max shrugged. "I've had him for years. Made a few upgrades along the way." Nina smirked. "A few upgrades? Looks like you went a little overboard." Her hands moved quickly, opening Atlas's casing and connecting diagnostic tools. "This'll take a bit, but I'll get him back online." Max watched her work, intrigued by her confidence and skill. "How long will it take?" "If it were a normal repair, maybe a few hours. But this droid of yours, it's going to take longer." She turned to face him. "You'll need a permit for some of these repairs, a Class 3 cybernetic intervention license." Max groaned. "Great. How long's that going to take?" "Standard processing, 2 to 3 business cycles," she replied, already diving back into her work. "But there might be a faster way, if you're interested." Max leaned in, sensing the shift in her tone. "What's the catch?" Nina looked at him, her lips curling into a mischievous smile. "Let's just say it involves creative documentation and a little dinner on the side." Max blinked. "Dinner?" She raised an eyebrow, her voice dropping to a teasing whisper. "You get my work done quicker, and I get a nice dinner. Seems like a fair trade." Max's eyes narrowed, But before he could reply, a sudden noise broke his concentration. The station's security system had just activated, and from the look in Nina's eyes, they both knew that trouble wasn't far behind. Max barely had time to process Nina's words before the air in the repair shop shifted. The sound of distant sirens echoed through the station, a reminder that they weren't exactly alone on Centura Station. Despite this, Nina moved with the calm assurance of someone who had seen far worse than a few flashing warning lights. She didn't even flinch as the noise from the security system grew louder, signaling that things were about to get more complicated. "All right, Max Carter, let's see what you've done to poor Atlas here," she muttered under her breath as she tapped a few commands into the holographic diagnostics panel. A series of holographic screens popped up around her, and she waved her hands through them, inspecting Atlas's internal systems with the efficiency of a seasoned technician. Max stood back, crossing his arms. The tension was thick in the room as he observed Nina work. He couldn't help but notice how quickly she moved, her hands sure and steady, her mind seemingly a step ahead of every system in error she was troubleshooting. There was something hypnotic about watching her work, as if every gesture was calculated and deliberate. "You've been busy," Nina said, her voice breaking the silence as she looked up at him. "These modifications aren't standard for a Mark 7, let alone the custom system upgrades you've added." Max tilted his head, his gaze narrowing as he looked at the droid in question. "I had to keep him adaptable, you know? Didn't want a droid that could only follow orders like some mindless machine. He's supposed to think, make decisions, feel like a person." Nina raised an eyebrow but said nothing at first, instead continuing to work on Atlas's malfunctioning circuits. There was a flicker of something behind her eyes, curiosity, maybe? Or maybe something more personal, but it passed quickly. "You've given him autonomy then," she said after a beat, voice quieter than before. "I get it, but you should have known that at some point. That would come with complications." Max was about to reply when she interrupted him, her fingers flying over the diagnostics, plugging in new components and reworking some of the most complex systems inside Atlas. "Look, these modifications are advanced," Nina continued, her voice now tinged with admiration. "Whoever did them, well, they knew what they were doing. But they didn't anticipate this." She gestured to the mess of malfunctioning systems. "The personality matrix you've installed, it's clashing with his core programming. It's not an easy fix." Max frowned, stepping closer. "You're telling me you can fix it, right?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, her eyes flicked back to the glowing holographic screens where streams of data flashed by at an alarming rate. Then, finally, she turned to him, locking eyes with a mixture of amusement and determination. "Oh, I can fix him," Nina said, a small smile playing at her lips. "But you're going to need to trust me." Max hesitated. The words hung in the air for a moment. He wasn't used to trusting people, especially not someone like Nina, who seemed to be more than just a mechanic. There was something else beneath the surface, a depth he couldn't quite place. But as he looked at Atlas, his loyal companion, malfunctioning yet still trying to quote Shakespeare in the middle of a deadly mission, Max realized something. He needed Atlas back. He needed the droid, not just for the mission, but for himself. Atlas had been by his side for too long, and he couldn't abandon him now, not when they were so close to the core of everything. "All right, Nina, do what you need to do," Max finally said, his voice resolute. Nina's smile grew wider, and she nodded. "I'll need some time, but I'll get him back to full functionality. You've done a great job with him. He's just a bit too unique for the standard repairs." Max leaned against a nearby workbench, watching her as she continued to work. "What about the permit? You mentioned a Class 3 cybernetic intervention." "Right," Nina replied, not missing a beat. "The official route takes too long, but I've got connections here. I've been on this station long enough to know how to make things move a little faster in exchange for a favor." Max raised an eyebrow. "A favor? What's that supposed to mean?" Nina turned her head to look at him, her gaze steady. "Well, let's just say I've got a vested interest in things that happen around here, the sort of things the Darkstar Syndicate doesn't want people talking about. If you can help me with something, I can help you with Atlas." Max stood straighter, thus his interest peaked. "What are we talking about?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tapped a few more commands on her screen, her focus unwavering. I'll tell you once Atlas is functioning again. You won't be disappointed. And in the meantime, you might want to think about how far you're willing to go for someone who's got a few secrets of their own. Max was about to ask more when Atlas's voice suddenly rang out, weak but unmistakable. All the world's a stage. Nina stifled a laugh, but Max just rolled his eyes. Great. He's back to quoting as you like it. This is progress, Nina said, amused. At least he's not reciting Hamlet anymore. That's a good sign. Max sighed, feeling a strange sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. So, what do you need from me? Nina didn't answer right away. She seemed to be considering her words carefully, weighing her options. Finally, she stood up and turned to face him, her expression serious. I need you to help me expose something that the Syndicate has been covering up, Nina said, her voice low and urgent. There's a network of corruption on this station, and I've been collecting evidence for months. I can't do this alone. But if you help me, we both get what we want. Max was silent for a moment, processing her words. The Syndicate, he knew they were a dangerous organization. But Nina's words didn't just sound like a job. It felt personal. There was more to this than just getting a droid fixed. Tell me everything, Max said, his voice low, as if speaking the words too loudly might make the situation even more real. Nina met his gaze and nodded. I'll explain soon. First, let's get Atlas back to full power. The rest can wait. But when this is over, you'll wish you hadn't asked. Max didn't flinch. He was in this deep now, and something about Nina's intensity told him that whatever happened next would change everything. The hum of the station's power systems pulsed like the beat of an anxious heart, filling the otherwise quiet repair shop. Max stood with his arms crossed, watching Nina work with a quiet intensity. Her hands were quick and practiced, deftly navigating Atlas's complex system, but every few minutes she glanced up at him, as if weighing the next words she was about to say. All right, Nina finally said, wiping grease off her hands and leaning back from the diagnostic screen. I've made some progress, but we'll need more than just quick fixes to get him running at full capacity. The Class 3 cybernetic intervention permit will take too long, but I've got a way around it. Max raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. What kind of way around it? Nina stood up and looked him in the eye. Official channels? They'll put us on hold for days, maybe longer. But I have some creative methods of getting things processed faster. She flashed him a wry smile, as if daring him to question her. Max took a step closer, his gaze sharp. Creative, huh? And what's the catch? She leaned against the workbench, her expression suddenly serious. The Syndicate's operations on this station are hidden in plain sight. I've been gathering evidence for months, and I'm close to breaking it all open. But I need help getting it past the station's regulatory filters, and that's where you come in. Max frowned, his mind racing. I'm no spy, Nina. I came here for a quick repair job. I don't want to get tangled up in whatever you're talking about. Nina's eyes narrowed, but there was no malice in her expression, just an unwavering confidence. You're already tangled up in it, Max. The Syndicate is all over this station. You think your mission's just about retrieving a data core? Think again. The core is a piece of a much bigger puzzle, one that can take them down, but I need the right intel, and that means bypassing all the red tape before it disappears. Max ran a hand through his hair, feeling a wave of unease wash over him. He knew Nina was right. He had already crossed a line by being here. But the promise of exposing the Syndicate, of bringing down a powerful criminal organization, had a certain allure, and Max had always been someone who couldn't resist a challenge. All right, he said, letting out a long breath. You've got my attention. What's the plan? Nina grinned, her eyes lighting up with a mix of excitement and mischief. First, we need to get the paperwork in, the kind they'll notice. Max's stomach sank. I thought you said the system would notice us either way. It will, Nina replied. But I'm not talking about the usual paperwork. I'm talking about a flood. Forms, applications, permits. If we overload their system with enough requests, they won't know what hit them. Max's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Overload the system? What good will that do? Picture this, Nina said, pacing in front of him. You've got a station-wide bureaucracy that moves at a glacial pace. The more we throw at them, the more we force them to act fast. We can sneak through while they're scrambling to handle the mess we created. Max's mind raced. You're telling me we're going to flood the system with paperwork? On purpose? Nina stopped pacing, a look of determination on her face. Exactly. And in the chaos, we'll get everything we need, and we'll get Atlas's repair approved under emergency intervention clauses. The bureaucrats won't even know what hit them. Max stared at her, impressed by the audacity of the plan. It was risky, sure, but there was something oddly thrilling about the idea of taking on an entire system with nothing more than a bunch of forms. And in a strange way, it felt like the right thing to do. All right, Max said, finally nodding. Let's do it. Nina's grin grew wider. Great, let's start with the permits for Atlas's repairs. We're going to need Form 32C for his modifications, 89D for military-grade equipment reclassification, and a whole stack of others just to make sure they can't ignore us. Max chuckled darkly. You weren't kidding about being creative. Nina tapped on her terminal, pulling up the first of many forms. You have no idea, and I'm only getting started. An hour later, they were surrounded by piles of virtual forms. The air was thick with the sound of Nina's quick fingers typing, her voice occasionally muttering to herself as she filled in data fields and attached fake documentation that would, hopefully, raise as many flags as possible in the station's monitoring system. Max, meanwhile, couldn't help but feel a little out of his depth. He had never imagined he'd be spending his time filling out forms to outsmart a bureaucratic system, but the more Nina explained, the clearer it became. The bureaucracy was the real enemy on Centura Station, and if they could expose its weaknesses, they could bring down the Syndicate. You're sure this is going to work? Max asked, watching as Nina submitted another form. I'm sure, she replied, tapping a few more keys. The more requests we throw at them, the faster they'll be forced to act. They can't process everything at once, and they'll be forced to approve the critical ones while ignoring the smaller stuff. We'll use that to our advantage. Max nodded, although the tension in his chest didn't ease. And after that, once we get Atlas's repairs done? Nina didn't look up from her work. Then we go after the data core. You've got your mission, and I've got mine. We'll make sure the Syndicate never sees us coming. Max hesitated for a moment, watching her. He still didn't fully trust her, but he was starting to understand why she was so driven. There was more at play here than just fixing a droid. The Syndicate was running rampant, and Nina was fighting a war of her own. Max had always believed in fighting for something bigger than himself, but now he was about to be part of a much larger scheme, and there was no turning back. Just as they prepared to submit the last of the paperwork, an alarm blared across the station's intercom. Security breach in Section 9! All personnel report to emergency stations. Max's heart skipped a beat. The Syndicate? He asked, his voice tight. Nina shot him a quick look, her expression grim. Or someone who doesn't want us to succeed. The alarm blared louder, shaking the walls of the repair shop, the flashing red lights casting an eerie glow over the workbenches. Max's mind raced, but he quickly pushed the panic aside. This wasn't the time to lose focus. The Syndicate had agents everywhere on this station, and if they were onto them now, the situation could spiral out of control. Damn it, Max muttered, looking over at Nina, who was already gathering her tools. Her eyes were sharp, alert, and ready for whatever came next. He couldn't tell if it was the thrill of danger or something else in her expression that made her so calm in the face of chaos. Stay close, Max, Nina said, grabbing a data pad and pulling up a set of blueprints for the station. We don't have much time. That breach is a distraction, probably an attempt to lock down the entire sector. They'll be scrambling to figure out what's happening. We'll use that confusion to our advantage. Max nodded, tightening his grip on his blaster. What's the plan? Nina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she traced a path on the holographic map, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. We'll head to the core access point, Section 7. That's where the data core is being held. The Syndicate's most secure vault is there. But we're not going in alone. We need a diversion. That's where Atlas comes in. Max turned toward the droid, who was still powering up on the workbench. Atlas's voice crackled to life, raspy and robotic. All the world's a stage, and we are merely players, it said in a robotic monotone. Nina smiled wryly. Perfect. The drama's about to begin. Max didn't need further explanation. The plan was insane, but it was their only shot. Atlas would create the perfect diversion by causing a scene, drawing attention away from them while Max and Nina snuck into the core vault. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he had a gut feeling that Nina had a knack for getting things done in the most unpredictable ways. All right, Max said, his voice grim. Let's move. Max and Nina made their way through the maze of corridors, their footsteps barely audible in the silence of the station's lower levels. The station's ventilation system hummed above them, and the occasional flicker of faulty lights added to the eerie atmosphere. Max couldn't help but glance over at Nina, who walked with purpose, her face a mask of concentration. You've done this before, he said quietly, trying to break the tension. Nina glanced at him briefly. Her eyes narrowed. A few times. Nothing quite like this, though. Max didn't need to ask for details. He could tell by the way she moved that she was used to high-stakes situations. He was starting to wonder if he had made a mistake in getting involved with her, but then the adrenaline hit. He had already crossed the line. There was no backing out now. They reached the door to Section 7, where the core was being held. The heavy steel door was locked, but Nina was already at work, her hands flying over a small terminal. She typed quickly, pulling up security overrides with ease. It only took a few moments before the lock clicked open with a satisfying thunk. As the door slid open, a rush of cool air greeted them, and Max's senses were on high alert. This was it. The core. The most valuable piece of evidence they had to expose the syndicate. But it wasn't going to be easy to get it. The room was dimly lit, lined with rows of secure terminals and data storage units. In the center, a reinforced glass box held the data core, gleaming and lifeless. It was locked in place by a powerful magnetic field, and even from a distance, Max could tell it was protected by a high-tech alarm system. Nina stepped forward, scanning the area with a careful eye. We've got to be quick. The alarm system is linked to the station's security network. One wrong move, and the whole place will go into lockdown. Max drew a deep breath and took a step closer. He knew the stakes. The core was essential to their mission, but it wasn't just about the data. It was about taking down the syndicate and exposing their web of corruption. Nina's voice broke through his thoughts. Max, stay sharp. I'm going to disable the magnetic lock. You need to keep watch. If we can get this open without triggering the system, we're home free. Max nodded, positioning himself by the door, his senses straining. He kept his eyes on the hall behind them, knowing that the distraction created by Atlas would only buy them so much time. He had no illusions. They were running on borrowed time. Meanwhile, Atlas was in the midst of his grand performance. He had been programmed with a vast collection of Shakespearean quotes, but Nina had reprogrammed him for the moment, turning him into a walking, talking distraction. And distraction was what they needed. In the main corridor, Atlas stood in the center of the station, his mechanical voice booming with theatrical flair, drawing the attention of every passerby. To be or not to be, Atlas declared, his metallic voice reverberating off the walls. That is the question. But I ask you, good people, what is the purpose of life when all we do is serve those who control us? His words were punctuated by dramatic pauses, his arms spread wide, as if giving a speech to an invisible audience. Passers-by slowed down, unsure of what was happening. Some stopped to watch, while others pulled out their comms to record the spectacle. Max couldn't help but smirk. It was absurd, but effective. Atlas was drawing all the attention, just as planned. But as the crowd grew, so did the danger. Max knew they didn't have much time before someone caught on that this wasn't just a malfunctioning droid. It was a deliberate diversion. The first few security officers rounded the corner, their eyes narrowing as they saw Atlas. Is that an illegal modification? One of them muttered into his comm, and the others started moving towards the scene. Max cursed under his breath. Nina, we're running out of time! Nina worked furiously, her hands a blur as she disarmed the final sequence in the magnetic lock. The seconds felt like hours as the soft hum of the system powered down and the core finally released from its prison. She slid it into a secure case just as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. It's done, she whispered urgently. Let's move. Max grabbed the case and they bolted for the door, but just as they reached it, alarms began to blare. "They're onto us," Nina said, her voice tense as she scanned the hallway. "We need to get out now." Max didn't need any more urging. They sprinted toward the maintenance tunnels, the sound of the security team closing in on their heels. The rush of their escape was exhilarating, almost too easy despite the near miss, but they both knew it wasn't over yet. As they disappeared into the shadows, the data core clutched tightly in Max's arms. Nina flashed him a grin. "We're just getting started, Max." Max and Nina's sprint through the maintenance tunnels was nothing short of frantic. The heavy clang of their footsteps reverberated through the narrow passageways, each step a reminder of the narrow window they had before the station's security forces caught up with them. The data core, now safely secured in a padded case, felt heavier with every step, though it was nothing compared to the weight of the situation they were in. Max's heart raced, adrenaline surging through his veins as they rounded a corner. The sound of pursuing guards was growing louder, their voices echoing through the tunnels. The plan had worked, mostly. They had the core, but now they were about to face a whole new set of challenges, escaping without getting caught. "You've got an escape route, right?" Max panted, barely able to keep up with Nina's rapid pace. Nina glanced over her shoulder, her eyes sharp and calculating. "I do. We're headed for the old service lift. It's rarely used, but it should be enough to get us to the docking bay." Max nodded, his trust in Nina deepening with every passing moment. She had been nothing short of brilliant, leading them through the labyrinth of bureaucracy, and now through a high-stakes heist. But it wasn't just her skill that impressed him. There was something about her. The way she kept cool under pressure, the way she made decisions so quickly and decisively, that made him feel like they were a team that could take on anything, together. Another explosion of sound echoed down the hall behind them, this time closer. Max's instincts kicked in, and he grabbed Nina's arm, pulling her sharply to the side, just as two security guards rounded the corner. They froze, eyes widening in recognition. "There!" one of them shouted, raising his blaster. Without hesitation, Max pushed Nina forward and dropped into a roll, narrowly avoiding the burst of fire. He came up with his blaster in hand, firing two quick shots that forced the guards to retreat into the shadows. They were buying time, but they couldn't keep this up forever. "Go!" Max shouted, his voice hoarse as he ran to catch up. "Get to the lift." Nina didn't hesitate. She was already several steps ahead, the familiarity of the tunnels giving her an edge. Max followed, trusting her every move. The maintenance tunnels were a maze, but Nina seemed to know exactly where to go. She ducked into a small alcove and stopped dead in her tracks, holding her hand up for silence. Max halted beside her, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. They stood in the dim light, listening. The clamor of security forces searching the area was still distant but closing in. Nina's lips pressed into a tight line as she scanned their surroundings. Her hand brushed against a panel on the wall, and with a subtle motion, the service lift doors opened silently, revealing the small, cramped space inside. "We're almost there," she murmured as they entered the lift. She hit a few buttons on the control panel, and the doors slid shut behind them, sealing them off from the chaos outside. Max's heart was still hammering in his chest, but the moment the lift started to move, the adrenaline began to ebb away, replaced by a quiet realization that they had made it. They were out of immediate danger, for now. As the lift ascended, the silence between them settled. Max couldn't help but glance over at Nina, who was staring ahead, her face still a mask of focus. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the tight set of her jaw. But there was something else there, too, a hint of satisfaction. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice still rough from the chase. "That was incredible. We pulled it off." Nina didn't look at him immediately, but she gave a small nod. "We did, but we're not done yet." She glanced over at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they'd started running. "We've still got a long way to go." Max felt the weight of her words, but instead of fear or doubt, there was a strange sense of resolve. She was right. They weren't done, not by a long shot. But this was a step, a big one. "You've got a hell of a way with people, Nina," Max said, his voice softer now. "Back there, with the paperwork, the diversion, Atlas, I didn't think it was going to work. But it did. Nina allowed herself a small smile, the first real one Max had seen from her. You learn to get creative when you're up against the system, and sometimes the best way to deal with chaos is to create your own. Her eyes softened for a moment, her guard slipping slightly. You're not so bad yourself, Max. You kept it together back there, even when things were falling apart. Max's chest tightened at her words. He wasn't used to this, working alongside someone, trusting them in the heat of the moment. He had always worked alone, a lone wolf in the vastness of space. But Nina was different. There was a partnership forming here, a bond forged under fire, and it felt like something he wasn't sure he'd ever experienced before. I guess we make a good team, huh? Max said with a half smile, leaning against the lift's wall. Nina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned back toward the lift's controls, her face hardening once again with resolve. We're not a team yet, Max. Not really, but we're close. The lift's slow ascent continued, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Max glanced down at the data core in his hands, then back at Nina. He knew this was only the beginning. The mission was far from over, but whatever happened, he wasn't going to face it alone. And just like that, he realized that Nina wasn't just a mechanic or a fellow rebel against the Syndicate. She was someone who could change everything. As the lift's final chime sounded, the doors opened to the dimly lit maintenance bay. Max stepped out first, scanning the area. The coast was clear, at least for now. You ready? Nina asked, her voice steady, as though she hadn't just been running for her life. Max gave her a grin, his confidence returning. Always. And with that, they moved out of the lift, ready to face whatever came next. They had the data core, they had the plan, and more importantly, they had each other. Max and Nina stood side by side, the weight of the data core now securely tucked away in the hidden compartment of the Star Voyager's cargo hold. The station's hum was quieter here in the secluded docking bay, as if the station itself was exhausted after the chaos that had unfolded. Max wiped his brow, feeling the exhaustion creeping up his spine, but there was a fire in his chest that wouldn't let him stop. They'd made it out, for now. The alarm still rang faintly in the distance, but here, in the shadows of the docking bay, it almost felt like they were safe. Almost. Well, that went better than I expected, Max said, breaking the silence. He glanced at Nina, who was standing with her arms crossed, staring out at the bay with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Nina gave a half smile, but there was no real joy in her eyes. We've got the core, but that doesn't mean the fight's over. The Syndicate knows we're here. They'll come for us eventually. Max's stomach tightened and he nodded. He knew what she meant. The Syndicate wasn't going to let something like this slide. They had eyes everywhere, and if they were lucky, they had a few hours before they would be forced to move again. But we've got something they don't, Max said, his voice firm with conviction. He looked at Nina, the glint in his eyes telling her everything she needed to know. We've got the truth, and with this core, we can take them down. Nina turned her gaze to him, her expression softening. For a moment, the hard edge she always carried seemed to slip away, leaving someone who wasn't just trying to survive, but to fight for something bigger. And what about us, Max? Nina asked, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. What happens after all this is over? After we've exposed the Syndicate? After we've won? Max hesitated. He hadn't really thought about what would happen after. The mission had always been clear. Retrieve the core, expose the corruption, bring down the Syndicate. But now, standing next to Nina, with the chaos of the mission still fresh in his mind, he realized that what came next was just as important. For the first time, Max considered that maybe there was more to this than just their shared fight. Maybe there was a connection, one that had been forged in the heat of battle and had only grown stronger with each passing moment. I don't know, Max said finally, a small smile tugging at his lips. But whatever happens, I'm not doing it alone. Nina looked at him for a long moment, and in that instant, Max saw something flicker in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. They weren't just allies anymore. They were partners. For better or worse, they had already crossed a line together, and now they were in it for the long haul. The silence between them was comfortable now, the weight of their shared mission pressing down on them, but not as heavy as it had been before. The unknown future lay before them, an open door to whatever came next. Suddenly, the soft whir of the Star Voyager's systems powered up, pulling them both back to reality. "We should go," Nina said, breaking the moment. "The Syndicate won't wait forever." Max nodded, but as he turned to follow her onto the ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, not just in the galaxy, but in the path his life was taking. As the ship's ramp closed behind them and the engines roared to life, Max looked out the small viewport, watching as Centura Station grew smaller in the distance. But his mind wasn't on the station anymore. It was on the road ahead, the future they were about to carve out. The Syndicate might still be hunting them, but now they had the upper hand. And whatever lay ahead, Max knew one thing for sure. Their fight wasn't just for survival, it was for freedom. For a future where they could decide their own fate. And as the Star Voyager shot into the void of space, the stars stretching into lines as they entered hyperspace, Max couldn't help but think that this universe, was about to become a whole lot more interesting. But the real question was, who would control it?